Wood Whisperer is sponsored by Powermatic and Typebond.
Designing on the fly can be incredibly risky, especially if you don't have a lot of experience, because you really have to make changes as you go to adapt to whatever happens with the project. So here's the story. My mom needs a sofa table, and she doesn't care what it looks like, she just needs it to be a certain size so it fits in the right spot. So I'm kind of free to do whatever I want. I've got a few ideas up here. I don't know that they're good ideas, but I have some ideas, and I just want to execute something that essentially is going to be a prototype. If it comes out great, awesome. If it looks like crap, it's going to go behind a couch, between the couch and the wall, so no one's ever really going to see it, except for a few thousand of my closest friends. But either way, we're just going to start building. I'm going to try to execute these ideas as I go, bob and weave with the plan, and it should be a lot of fun. So let's get to it.
This is all I'm starting with. A top view of a tapered leg set at a 45-degree angle, connected to rails via steel dowels with a gap between them. The legs are at the heart of this design, so I'll start there. I've got a nice piece of 8/4 walnut that should give me enough material for the legs and maybe even the rails. When cutting a rough slab like this one, I like to make the cut in several passes. This slowly releases the pressure and helps prevent pinching the blade. I also like to rough rip at the bandsaw. Ripping a rough piece of stock at the table saw is no bueno. The pieces are being milled flat and square. The length is the only critical dimension since the end goal is a 30-inch tall table. To orient the legs at 45 degrees, I need to re-establish the square corner on the back edge of the leg. 2 cuts at the table saw should do the trick. I don't normally condone using your hand behind the blade as you see me doing here, but on some cuts it's either that or a janky cut. With a featherboard and a push stick, I find it to be safe enough. Your mileage may vary. The new corner should be nice and square. Before I do any shaping, I need to drill for the steel pins. These holes need to be drilled very accurately, so I'll lay out one leg first. I'm putting 2 holes on one side and 3 on the other. This staggered arrangement allows all of the pins to penetrate deeply without colliding inside the leg. To transfer these locations to the other 3 legs, I'll make a marking gauge from scrap. The gauge will reference from the top of the legs and will have 3 marks on one side and 2 marks on the other. Now the hole locations can be marked quickly and accurately. We'll use this thing again later. To drill the holes, I'll clamp 2 legs together to make a 45-degree cradle. Now each leg will feature a taper on the outside edge. The question is, how much taper? On the left is a 1/2 inch and on the right is 1 inch. 1/2 inch is too little, but I'm not quite sure that I want to risk a full inch, so I'll compromise and go with 3/4. To cut the tapers, I'll make a single-use tapering jig. I start with a piece of 1/4 inch ply. The leg is oriented so that the taper line lines up with the edge. You can ignore that mark on the plywood, that's just, well, I don't know what that is. I lightly clamp the leg in place while I glue on some registration pieces. A 45-degree cutoff works great as a long support. A little CA glue will secure it to the plywood. A small strip will suffice as the backstop. To secure each leg for the cut, I put blue tape on the leg and the jig with a dab of CA glue between them, and it's ready to go. There are obviously better tapering jigs out there, but this one took about 5 minutes to make out of scrap and it gets the job done. To shape the legs, I'll start by sacrificing my drawing to make a little reference template. I need a second template for the smaller profile at the bottom of each leg. So I'll start with the top template and bring the dimensions in from there. Now I'll transfer the profiles to the top and bottom of the legs. I'll also draw a few guidelines along the length that connect the top profile to the bottom profile. At the table saw, I can carefully cut away some excess stock. Back at the bench, I'll use a hand plane to remove the rest of the stock back to the lines on the end grain. This isn't difficult work, but it is a real nice arm workout. I'm using a low angle jack plane for this. The long sole is great for making sure that the leg profile is nice and straight from top to bottom, but by pushing the plane at a pretty severe angle, I could target high points on the leg without the rest of the sole getting in the way. Later on in the project, I was able to look at the legs more critically and even got some help from my friends on Instagram and decided that the 3/4 inch taper just wasn't enough, so I'm increasing it to 1.25 inches. Because the cut is getting a little bit dicey at this point, I'll use the bandsaw with the table at an angle to remove as much stock as I can from each leg. At a certain point, I really felt like I was slicing off some sweet Euro meat. Back at the bench, I resume my upper body workout with my new profile in place. When I feel like it's close to where it needs to be, I start taking long strokes with the plane in line with the leg, letting the plane straighten the surface as much as possible. I check my progress with a straight edge and then rework the high spots. The result of the planing is a fine series of flats, and what we really want is a smooth, rounded profile, so a rasp helps me blend everything in. And a scraper helps smooth and refine the surface. To thin the legs just a little bit more, I add a slight taper to the back corner edge. I could then round it over using a block plane and some sanding. The top of each leg gets a chamfer. A wood clamp keeps the leg stable and makes this operation a lot safer. The final shaping and smoothing of the legs is done with a sander. This back and forth motion helps smooth the curve while also getting rid of the tooling marks, and it makes the whole leg really nice and smooth. The final detailing is done with some hand sanding. Now let's move on to the rails. Again, the thickness here just isn't critical, but I want them to be as thick as possible from 4/4 stock. Using the marking gauge that I made earlier, I can locate the exact drilling locations on the ends of the rails. To drill the holes, I'll use this nifty self-centering doweling jig. I just line up the 1/4 inch hole with my lines and drill to the appropriate depth. Now let's make some steel pins. They'll be cut from steel rods that I picked up at Home Depot, nothing fancy. The length is 2.5 inches, that's an inch for the depth into each workpiece and a 1/2 inch gap between them. It's a good idea to clean up and chamfer the ends of the pins so that they don't mangle the holes during the assembly. I'll buff the center of each pin to brighten it up. And to give our glue something to bite into, I'll use a file to rough up the ends of the pins. So now's a good time for a little dry assembly. I'm fully aware at this point that stability is going to be a concern for this table. With gaps between the pieces, there's no shoulder contact between the rails and the legs, which dramatically weakens the connection. So the question we don't quite have the answer to yet is, will this be strong enough? We'll find out soon. With 1/2 inch spacers installed, I can measure for the cross pieces that will secure the floating top. The cross pieces will be connected with sliding dovetails, so I'll cut the slots on the inside of the long rails. Using the same bit, I'll run the rails vertically and sneak up on the male portion of the joint. It's a real good idea to use a test piece for this. After sneaking up on the fit, I'll route the rails. I use a cutting gauge to scribe the shoulder and help prevent tear out. The pieces all slide in easily and sit proud of the rails, on purpose. That's how we'll get the floating effect for our top. I think a decorative profile will look really nice on these pieces. Maybe a little curve at the bottom and 2 upturned curves at the top. To prepare for the screws, I'll counterbore some holes on the bottom of the cross pieces. This hides the screw heads and helps me get the screw penetration that I want into the top. By the way, if you're going to drill into a curved or angled surface with a Forstner bit, clamping is not optional. I carefully carried my screw location around to the other side of the workpiece and use a 1/4-inch bit to punch the rest of the way through. This will allow the screw to have just a little bit of wiggle room. To make more room, you can move the bit up and down while putting side pressure on the workpiece. I struggled for a while trying to figure out what edge treatments to give the rails. Ultimately, I decided to give the bottom edge a fingernail round over profile, and the top edge a small chamfer to match the chamfer at the top of the legs, and also the chamfer we're going to be putting into our top, which you'll see later. The top support pieces will get a little chamfer action too. Everything else is non-critical and gets a small 1/8 inch roundover. I'll get a head start on the assembly process by pre-gluing the pins into the rails. I'm using West System epoxy with a little filler added to thicken it up and hopefully improve the bond. The pins should go in easily and epoxy will definitely push its way out. I'll then use a mallet to help force out any remaining air. The excess glue is removed with a paper towel, and then everything's cleaned up with a little bit of acetone. The acetone is great because it spreads a small amount of diluted epoxy around evenly into the end grain, and that helps prevent uneven staining that might occur otherwise. Now I'll let that cure for a few hours. With the pins pre-glued into the rails, the final assembly is a lot less messy and stressful. Remember those 1/2 inch plywood spacers that we used before? I'm using them again, only now they're coated with packing tape to help prevent the epoxy from sticking to them. And yes, I am working late at night in my pajamas, like a boss. I thought a lot about the best way to clamp something like this. With no flat surfaces anywhere, it's a real challenge. I found the best solution to be a band clamp, which is usually used for picture frames, and it worked like a charm. Since there's nothing holding the lower portion of the legs in place, we have to expect the spacing to be slightly off. So I need to use a clamp to bring the right legs just a bit closer. And on the other side, I need them to be slightly further apart, so I'll use a piece of dowel stock as a spacer. The next day, I'll flip the table over and remove the spacers. Now I can add the top supports. Sliding dovetails have a tendency to bind during glue up. Water-based glues will swell the fibers, causing a super tight fit. So to avoid any issues, I'll again use epoxy here as it doesn't contain any water and shouldn't cause any swelling. Time for the top. I've selected 3 boards that I've brought down to about 1.25 inches thick. I arrived at this number by doing a lot of sitting around and staring. Instead of gluing these guys together like we would for a regular table, I'm spacing them 1/4 inch apart and using a larger 3/8 inch steel dowel to hold them together. Some people love this idea, and some absolutely hate it, which means it's perfect! For the edge treatment, I'll apply a 25-degree bevel to the bottom edge. The 3/8 inch pins are cut just as before. And the top is sanded to 220 and then glued together. I'm being a little bit less generous with the epoxy on this one because cleaning up any squeeze out would be a nightmare. So I'll wipe up the holes with some acetone before adding the pins, and I won't put any epoxy on the pins themselves. They'll get plenty once I insert them and twist them around. Some 1/4 inch spacers ensure a nice even gap. What do you think of my tabletop?
Not cool.
Not cool?
Just kidding.
You stink! Now we can attach the top to the base. The base is centered, and I use spack screws for the final attachment. I'll give the piece one final inspection and sanding before removing the top and starting the finishing process. The finish I'm using is Osmo Pollux. It's a fancy oil wax blend that's incredibly easy to apply. Simply wipe on with a white Scotch-Brite pad, buffing it into the surface. By the way, pre-finishing on a piece like this would make life a whole lot easier, but when designing on the fly, I don't even think about the finishing process until I feel like the construction is complete, so I'm stuck finishing after assembly. I then like to remove any standing excess with a paper towel and then finish it off by buffing the heck out of the surface with a clean Scotch-Brite pad. Now the base is finished the same way. I'll apply a total of 2 coats with an overnight cure in between. The more I use this finish, the more I like it, but you have to understand what it is and what it isn't. It's a hard wax oil, which as the name implies, is oil and wax. By nature, it's not super protective like a film finish. You do get some protection, but it's not quite like using a wiping varnish or a lacquer. So make sure your expectations are in the right place when using stuff like this. But understand that it's easy to apply, easy to repair, and leaves a buttery smooth finish. I'll report back when I can say firsthand how this stuff holds up over time on furniture.
Well, there you go. I made a thing, and it's kind of a weird thing. This was a wild ride. I mean, this was basically 5 days from conception to completion of the project, which for me is a really, really fast pace. But when you're building without plans, you can do things like that, and you just adjust on the fly and just kind of come up with creative solutions to problems. And I highly recommend it. It's a really good exercise. And if you are a fairly competent woodworker, you can bob and weave and make adjustments so that in the end, what is essentially a prototype is still a usable piece of furniture that someone will enjoy. Now this one's going to my mom. This thing could look absolutely awful and she would love it. This is like, you know, the equivalent of that handmade birthday card that you make for your parents when you're a kid and they love it no matter what. So my mom's cool with it, but ultimately I was building this as an experiment for myself. I wanted to try a few things. I wanted to see how stable a connection, a sort of disjointed, separated, deconstructed connection, how strong that would be. And I got my answer. It's definitely strong enough for the task. I mean, this thing will take plenty of weight. What it won't take is excessive racking forces. Now, most tables like this aren't really going to receive those forces. That would be something like a diagonal crushing force this way. Those pins, if you pull really hard on that leg, I'm sure those pins are going to pull right out of that rail, and that's okay because we're not expecting that kind of force to be applied. But this sort of table probably isn't good for a house with a lot of kids who are rough on furniture. This one is going into an adult's home and will be treated with respect and care, so it should be fine. But these are the things we keep in mind. You know, you don't have to make bomb-proof furniture. You can sometimes make just interesting and artistic and weird furniture just because you can and because you want to, and it looks different than anything else out there. All right, so this was a lot of fun. I hope it inspired you to kind of think outside the box a little bit, and even some of the techniques and the different things we did with the details on this, maybe you could extract those and apply them to some other project of yours. Right? It's all a learning process, it's all about sharing, and most importantly, it's all about, bucking convention and doing some fun things and having a good time with it. So I hope you tolerated my trying to be creative for a little while and had some fun with me on this one. Thanks for watching.